Okay, welcome everybody. My name's Jo Phillips. I'm Marketing Manager at Governor Hub. Delighted you're joining us for this Governor Hub session on how to take control of your role and career. It's International Women's Day, which is great. We're putting on this event today because we did some research last year and we found that over 90% of those working to manage governance across a trust are women. So we really hope today will be practical and useful. We know the theme of International Women's Day this year is inspiring inclusion. So we're sharing knowledge, hopefully, and supporting you, supporting others. We know from experience that governance can occasionally be overlooked. So we thought this session could hopefully be quite valuable. We've got some men signed up too, which is great. The session is for everybody. And I'm absolutely delighted that we have Mandy Coalter with us today. I heard Mandy speak at a conference last year and thought it was really inspiring. Mandy was speaking about school cultures. She's been Director of People at United Learning, one of the biggest trusts in the country, founder of Talent Architects. I'll hand over to Mandy in just a sec. But just to say, Mandy will speak for about 45 to 50 minutes, and then there'll be a bit of time to ask questions. So pop your questions in the chat as Mandy's finishing up, and we should be able to get to some of those. But yes, thank you for joining us. Thank you for giving us your time today. And without further ado, I will hand over to Mandy. Thank you, Mandy.
Thank you, Jo, for that warm intro. Really appreciate it. And happy International Women's Day, everybody. And great to have you virtually all here at this session. And I really do hope that you get some useful, practical things to take away. But absolutely, do pop things in the chat, ask questions in the chat, and we'll make sure we cover as much as possible in the time that we've got. Just a little bit about me. I cannot believe that I'm entering my 30th year as an HR professional, and I've operated at director level for many of those years. But in essence, having been an HR professional for all that time, I've taken a huge interest in people's development, careers, support, recruitment. So hopefully got some useful things to impart with you today. As Jo said, I was Director of People in a very large academy trust, but I'm also a trustee of a trust local to me that educated my son, so very dear to my heart. And I'm also actually a trustee of the National Teaching Awards. And if you don't know about them, go and find out, because they're an amazing way to celebrate success in our sector. So that's just a little bit about me. And obviously today we're talking about careers and career management and career conversations. And these are the things that I want to cover in the session, and I hope you'll take away from today. Firstly, to think about how you can take responsibility and control your own career plan. The one thing I learned fairly early on in my career was that actually nobody else was going to do it for me. And I really had to take some responsibility and make things happen myself. So let's talk about how you might do that and what the options open to you on that. And some practical tips then on how you do manage your career development, particularly when you are in a standalone role or an organisation where there isn't a ladder for you to climb necessarily. So what options are there for you when that's the case? I want to talk about having influence and persuading, because I think that's an important skill set for anybody actually nowadays, but particularly having worked a lot with governance professionals, I know that's something you have to do an awful lot of. So we hope that will help you, and we'll have some practical thoughts on that as well. And then finally, how to approach challenging and sometimes difficult conversations. And we'll talk about giving and receiving feedback, having difficult conversations. And within that, we'll touch a little bit about what if the conversation is about your pay or terms and conditions, because I know that can be a real hot potato. And how do you do that with, I guess, professionalism and integrity? So that's what we're going to cover in the session, which I hope, as I say, you'll take away some practical things. And there will be a couple of points where I'll ask you to pop things in the chat, but do keep questions coming in as well for us to cover at the end. So first question is for you, and we'd love you to just pop some thoughts in the chat on this. What are some of the challenges maybe that you are facing in your role or in your workplace at the moment? And if you wouldn't mind just taking 30 seconds to just pop into chat some of the things that are on your mind and maybe why you're here today.
We haven't actually had any comments in the chat. Oh, yeah, coming through. Brilliant. Thank you. Oh, sorry, they're all coming
Takes
through
a
at once
while,
now.
doesn't it?
Managing change, managing workload,
Mm.
shifting cultures, high workload, recruitment, finding time. Yeah, workload, change. I think there are some themes coming through there.
Yeah, I think lots of trusts are growing, aren't they? And you're probably absorbing more and more. And hopefully we'll talk a little bit about that today, because that might be about how you influence that, particularly if you feel you need more resource or more support, or you might need to talk to somebody about your workload. I can see there's a bit more coming in chat. Is there anything else on top of that, Joe, that's come up?
Yeah, being seen, sort of visibility, expectations from governors, low salary, lack of appreciation, not being paid for the hours worked. Yeah, so some themes around that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we are definitely going to cover some of those aspects today. So hopefully you'll get what you need from the session. Okay, thank you everybody for that. Really appreciate that input. Okay, so let's start with thinking about managing your career and navigating essentially your career. And I don't know if anybody's ever read Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In. Cheryl's chief operating officer at Facebook, and she wrote this book a few years ago. And it's particularly, actually, the book is about women in leadership. Although actually I think men and women can learn a lot from the content in the book. And there's a whole chapter quite early on. She starts by saying careers are a jungle gym, not a ladder in today's world. And I was really struck by that quote at the time. I was working in an academy trust, which of course is a super large trust now. But actually, the central team was really quite small. And we were always having conversations with staff about, but there's no career ladder, where do I go next? So it was a very real, live, topical issue. And actually, what she talks about in this chapter is, look, that's the case, though, in many organizations nowadays, whether you're super large or small, there aren't the whole career ladders that maybe some of us expected early on in our career. Actually, we have to be much more flexible about how we develop. That might sometimes mean we have to take a sideways move or take on a project, or maybe even take a bit of a step back to learn some new skills to then take a step forward. So this idea of a jungle gym, and if you've got that image in your head, you're kind of moving around, aren't you, from rope to rope all over the place rather than going up in this linear fashion. And I think for a lot of us working in academy trusts in schools, particularly if you look at academy trusts as they're growing, quite often that does present opportunities because the role develops. You take on more, suddenly you might need more resource, somebody else working alongside you. But sometimes it's hard to get the case across for that, and you end up absorbing a lot more. So I want to talk a little bit about that later, because that's about, I think, influence, persuasion, and honest conversations. But I think it is important for all of us to recognize that nowadays, there isn't going to be that lovely, neat structure that maybe, like I say, when I came into the world of work 30 years ago, that kind of was the expectation. But I think it changed quite quickly after that. And there's a lovely sheet that you can't see all the detail here, but you'll be able to have a look at if you get the slides later, where it actually gets you thinking about, well, what were careers like in the past, yesterday, and what are they like now? And I think there are some key things here. It starts with saying in the old days, you kind of expected the organization to manage your career. And this is the time when, you might enter an organization and stay a long time, and you expected there to be that career ladder, and they would have regular conversations with you, and that's where you go. Actually, nowadays, it's much more self-directed. It's much more about us taking responsibility and deciding what we want to do next and moving. Similarly, they make the point in the sheet that it's not a ladder, it's a lattice, as they call it. So it's about moving around. And then they talk about different aspects of career development and how it's moved on. But I think these are some of the key messages that you see in that. Take responsibility, jungle gym, not a career ladder or lattice. And then that ability to learn, develop, and be agile, because actually, the world of work is so different to when I came into it 30 years ago. But actually, it's really different to what it was 5 years ago, pre-pandemic. And that pace of change now with AI and technology is just going to keep moving forward. So actually, even if you're somebody that thinks, well, I don't want to develop my career in the sense of I don't want to progress a level, all of us need to constantly refine and develop our skills. Even if we intend to stay doing the same job, what we're expected to do and how we do it will change. And many of you've raised workload, which is a really interesting one, isn't it? Because we know that AI and automation and technology can make a big difference there. I do a lot of work with trusts looking at teacher workload and frontline staff workload, and we know for sure there are definitely things that we can streamline and do better, but they'll often take upfront investment and a business case to get those. And actually having the skills to do those things is really important. So always learning, and taking responsibility for your own professional development, whether you want to progress or not, I think is such a core skill nowadays to be successful. And the other message in the sheet is that, managers, your line manager, their role is now more about coaching you and developing you rather than absolutely saying this is the next rung on the ladder and off you go. And now some of you hopefully have got a brilliant person you report to who's really good at that. And sometimes, of course, that isn't always the case. And we have to manage that dynamic. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. One of the things I think it's really important to do if you want to keep developing, progress your career, is really know yourself and think about how you might sell your skills. And as we started out with the session, we know that governance is a predominantly female profession. And a lot of the evidence and research tells us that women in particular find it difficult to actually recognise everything they do and sell that in the workplace and promote ourselves. It just feels a little bit alien. I know that actually can apply to men as well, but there is something particularly, I think, for women around this. And that's hard because, you can sometimes be reluctant, can't you, to feel like you're on this self-promotion journey. But actually, if you don't say what you're good at, or you don't really know what you're good at, how can we expect anybody else to know? So it's a fine balance because we've got to do it with care and influence, but I think it is important that we actually value ourselves and we recognise what we're good at and what we do. But also, we think beyond the workplace as well, because sometimes we're doing things outside of work that are really important skill sets. I'm a trustee of 2 charities. I don't get paid for that. It's voluntary responsibility. But as you can imagine, it brings a huge skill set to the table. Some of you might be doing something like that. You might be school governors in other schools, or you might be a trustee in another trust, or there might be various things you do, or you might be involved in a community charity or a local initiative, or whatever it might be. Most of us are doing lots of things in our lives that we're not necessarily just doing in work. And I think it's a great exercise, and I really encourage you to do this today. Take some time for yourself on International Women's Day to just think about all the roles that you do in your life, both in work and outside of work, and then all the different skills that are associated with those roles. Or you can simply write a list of what you're good at. And then it's about reflecting on, okay, how do I make sure that people are aware of this? They know what I've got to offer. And I effectively market those skills. So do take some time today. I know you'll all have busy days, but I would really encourage you to do that. Now, one of the things you can do, of course, is to think about, okay, if I know what I'm good at and I know what my skills are, how do I have a conversation about that in the workplace? And I think the appraisal conversation is a really great vehicle for that. I hope most of you are working in workplaces where there is an appraisal process and that it has a focus on your CPD, your training. I know that can be challenging if you don't have that. And if you don't have that and it's not consistent, then maybe it's about approaching your boss and saying, can we sit down and talk about my goals, my targets, and my aspirations? But let's assume that you have got an appraisal process. How do you get the most out of it? And I honestly believe that, you get out of it what you put in. I've worked with people who have literally turned up on the day and given no thought whatsoever to it. And that's tough then to have some honest conversations about what they're doing well, how they might grow and develop. The very best teams I've worked with are when people absolutely take it seriously because their performance matters to them. They want to be the very best they can be. They want to be honest and reflective about that. And they want to talk about what they need to do professionally to continue to improve. And those are the great conversations. And certainly when I was sitting on the other side as the boss, those are the wonderful conversations where the person really is wanting to stretch and grow and develop, and you just want to support them. And similarly, when I've sat on the other side as the person being appraised, actually being able to go in there, feeling prepared, thinking about what I want to talk about, how I want to approach it, has made a huge difference to this process. And appraisals can get a bit of a bad name, and sometimes they're not great processes. And I encourage HR professionals to make sure they are great processes. But, even if you haven't got the best policy in the world, I think if you prepare and take some time and think about it, you can get an awful lot out of that process. So what are the things that you should think about then to do that well? Firstly, it's thinking about gathering information. So it's thinking about all the things that you do in your role, the things that you've achieved, and maybe keeping some kind of journal on this. Talk about here a performance journal. What are the things you think you've done really, really well? Preparing that list of your accomplishments and being proud to go in and own those, share them, and like I say, market what you've done. Doing a self-evaluation and being really honest as well, because none of us are perfect. None of us get everything right. And actually, if you're the person that's prepared to go in and say, I've done all these things brilliantly, and I wish that went better, and I've thought about why, and this is what I would do differently, and this is what I'd like to learn from that process. That's a great conversation to have with an appraisee, because as a manager, that they, in effect, they've given themselves feedback and they've already thought about what they need to do differently in the future. And of course, that makes the conversation easier for the manager in a way, because you're not having to give difficult feedback. But actually, the fact that the person's owning that means you've got confidence that they'll do something about it. So whilst I would really encourage you to focus on all those positives, your performance, your accomplishments, all the things you're really proud of, also be honest and reflect and think about how you might learn and grow, and be prepared to talk about that in the session. And think really hard about what development you do want to discuss in your appraisal. What do you think professionally is going to help stretch you, grow you? What might help you advance your career if there is some opportunity you can see coming up on the agenda? What are the things that might help you get there? And we'll talk in a moment about some of the ways that you could professionally develop that aren't going to cost the earth, because I think that's often the challenge, isn't it? If we go into an appraisal and we want to do a really expensive training course, quite often the budgets aren't there for that. But actually, in my experience, whilst some of the courses you can attend can be great, and particularly if you want to get professionally qualified, there are so many other things you could do that actually can be just as helpful to progress your skills. And if you do want to get professionally qualified, if that's something that really matters to you, then it's thinking through what's in it for the trust in terms of you being professionally qualified. What are the things they will get out of that? And of course, there'll be huge amounts they can get out of that in terms of the quality of what you'll be able to do, the advice, the risk management for the trust, and all of that. So it's really thinking that through, thinking through your options. How can you get the best cost-effective development? But also, if you do want a bit of investment, what's the business case for the trust really? What will they see from it? Think about what you want to achieve in the year ahead, and always prepare everything with an open mind, because who knows what your boss might want to raise in the meeting. So having that open mind and being reflective is really important. And we'll talk later in the session about feedback and how to give feedback, but also receive feedback, and particular feedback that might be difficult. If your boss suddenly says something and you think, oh, wow, I'm not sure I agree with that. How do you manage that? We'll talk about that later in the session, because that can be quite tough at times. But really making sure that you're prepared for this is going to help you get the outcome you want. And also it shows that you're serious about the process and you're serious about achieving your trust and you're serious about your professional development. And as I said, sometimes there are ways that we can find to develop ourselves that don't cost the earth. We should always be thinking about whether the apprenticeship levy can fund particular professional training, because the levy can be spent on existing staff. It's, I don't know if people are familiar with the apprenticeship levy. And of course, when we think about apprenticeships, we tend to think about youngsters coming into the workplace and training. But actually, you can use levy funding to fund existing staff of any age development. So that's worth looking into. Has your trust got some arrangements for the apprenticeship levy? Can you talk that through with anybody and get some advice on how that might help you? But then beyond that, there's all these other things that you can do, a project. Can you take on a project? Maybe new schools are joining the trust. Can you get involved in aspects of that? Because that's a great experience to be involved in, and making sure the governance aspects are right there. Secondments can be really useful. And I've certainly worked with those in governance who have taken some time to try a different role and then come back and found that really, really useful. But taking on additional responsibility, and that's always a tough one, isn't it? Because sometimes we can be a bit nervous about that if it doesn't come with the pay. And we have to be careful about that. And we'll talk later about pay. We do have to be careful that we're not taking on so much that suddenly we're undervalued and underpaid. But I think at the same time, thinking through, okay, how could I take on a bit of stretch, something new, without necessarily needing a big pay hike that's just going to give me something, and I can see how that will help me then continue to develop my career. Shadowing somebody. Can you go to another trust for a day that's maybe a bit bigger, or doing some different things, going through a merger or whatever's going on, so you can shadow your counterpart there and see what they do, how they're approaching things. I remember doing that early on in my career with HR directors, and it was probably one of the most valuable things I ever did. Alongside coaching and mentoring. Mentoring for me early in my career was just a game changer. And there's a slight difference between coaching and mentoring. A coach tends to just ask you very open questions, whereas a mentor, they'll also ask you lots of open questions, but they'll give you advice. And so you might want to approach as a mentor a very experienced governance professional who you really respect and admire, and they're doing some great work. Maybe they could be your mentor, somebody to give you some guidance and advice and support on how they've approached things professionally. A coach doesn't have to be the same profession. I coach lots of people, head teachers, chief execs. I coach people. I've never done the job. But when you're coaching, it's much more about helping that individual reflect and learn and grow themselves. And so that can be quite useful for things like career development coaching. You just want somebody to help you reflect on where your career is going. Or it can be useful for things like, I'm struggling with relationships at work, don't get on with my boss, don't get on with the chair, whatever it might be, can be really quite powerful for those kind of things. So there's a difference between the two. And you can actually get both in one individual if you choose somebody with the right skill set. I've already talked about voluntary work and how powerful that is. I can't tell you how much I've learned through the charity work I do and learnt skills I never would have had. And that's a total possibility. It's something you may be doing already. Or you might want to think about, okay, could I join a school governing body? Could I join the board of a trust? Or could I get involved in a charity? And I think particularly if you get involved in a governance capacity, as a trustee, that's particularly useful learning, because you'll see what's going on somewhere else and you'll learn, you'll bring that back, but also you will bring great skills to that arena, really important skills, because you'll know that lots of trusts need help with governance. So it's a really great two-way thing. But even actually voluntary work beyond that can bring certain skills and development. And then I like the idea, which I heard a little while ago, of a career buddy. And what is a career buddy? Well, a career buddy is somebody who will support you. And, it could be somebody at home, could be a spouse or a partner or a family member. It could be somebody at work. It could be, like I say, another professional in another organization that you've got a good relationship with, and maybe your mentor. But in essence, it's somebody who's really interested in you, how you're progressing, and they're excited for you, as you achieve things. They're there, they've got your back, they're by your side. They'll encourage you when things might get a bit sticky and a bit tricky. They're there to keep you motivated. They will give you time and they'll celebrate your achievements. And that can be combined with a mentor, actually, which is nice. Or it could just be a peer. And again, often in governance, you're on your own, you're isolated. But is there somebody else around you that is supporting schools that also maybe is in that standalone position and could do with that support too? And could you actually work together and just support each other through that journey? So I want to pause there. If you've got any questions around that, do pop them in chat, and we will, as we've said, have time at the end to consider those. But if you've got burning questions and you want to write them now, that's absolutely fine. And Jo will help make sure we cover them later. So I want to move on to talk about influence and persuasion. And these skills, I think, are critical for many jobs nowadays. But I think particularly when you are in a role where it's a little bit isolated, maybe it's only you, and you're trying to get people to do things differently, or you're trying to achieve certain outcomes. A lot of you talked about things like workload. How might you influence that if your workload's really high and you think you need more resources? How are you going to influence that and persuade people to do things differently? And I want to ask you this question first. And again, if you wouldn't mind popping answers into the chat. When you think about the word power, I'd like you to just pop into chat. What words come to mind? What are the first things you think of when you think of the word power?
Money, knowledge, influence, strength, authority, robustness, experience, decision-making, control, decision-making, bullying, resilience, leadership, persuasion, influence, money, strength,
It's quite
command.
interesting, isn't it? Because there's lots of good positives there, but we've also got things like command, bullying, money, which we might see as a bit more negative. And I think sometimes we do think about power in quite a negative way. And of course, we do often see people misuse power, unfortunately. But actually, if you want to influence or persuade anybody to do something differently, or to give you what you think you need to do your job well, then you have to think about, how do I build my own power base? And of course, it's like anything, isn't it? It's the motivation for doing that. We've all worked, sadly, with people, I think, who perhaps have misused their power and have done things for self-gain. And that's not what we're talking about here. That's clearly not what we're talking about. But actually, if you use power well, it can help you influence. And particularly when you're trying to navigate organizational politics. And I can tell you for now, there is not a single organization in the entire world that doesn't have organizational politics. It is a fact of life. There are people that have more power and influence in organizations than others. As I say, the trick is to build good power and use it with good intent. And in essence, power, it's deliberate efforts made by individuals and groups in organizations to use power in the pursuit of their own particular interests. That's organizational politics. Pursuit of their own particular interests is the key here, because that's when, of course, it can be quite self-serving. And that's when it's the negative politics, if you like. But actually, politics, engaging in the politics of an organization, helps you achieve the things that you know are right for the organization. So if you take an example, it's not great if your workload is unmanageable, because stuff is not getting done that needs to get done. It's not great if governance is not where it needs to be in the organization, because the risks attached with that and the issues. And you also know all the evidence tells us that good governance is critical to running a successful organization. So hopefully you see my point there. This is about achieving outcomes that are the right outcomes to have. Also, there are times when your own self-interest matters. If you're working so many hours that it's making you ill, that isn't good for the organization, and it definitely isn't good for you. So having some degree of self-interest here does actually matter, but it's always recognizing if I'm building power and thinking about my influence, how am I actually using it? And power is simply just the capacity to get others to do things they might not have done otherwise. It can be situational or personal. So situational is where, somebody's senior, they're the chair, they're the CEO. So basically they have power just by the nature of their job. Or it can be personal, and you'll know people who've got an awful lot of influence, but aren't necessarily in a senior role. That appropriate use of power is actually really important for effective leadership, and perceived motives are everything. So as well as your actual motives, also be aware of how will people perceive what I do. Because actually you might be approaching something with good intent, but there may be perception. And often the area that's a little bit knotty here is where you're thinking, I know I'm underpaid. I've done the benchmarking, I can see that, and I want to raise that. But then how do you get that to shift without it being seen as very self-interested? And I'm going to come back to that at the end, because I think there are definitely things you can do. And actually HR professionals often find that issue quite tricky to manage as well. Political behaviour. And if you want to engage in this in a positive way, there's a couple of things to be thinking about here. And I'd like you to just think about, where you might sit on this spectrum. And I'd also like you to pop, if you don't mind again, in chat. Sorry, Joe, keep you busy. I'd like you to just pop in the chat. Where do you think on this is the optimal place to be? So you've got at the top, very high awareness of what's going on around you, bottom, low awareness. Then on the left, you've got that self-centered motive. And then you've got on the other side, on the right, other-centered motive. So you wouldn't mind just popping in chat. Where do you think? And if you're talking about left and right, do it as you're looking at the screen. This works much better when you're in a room with people and they can point.
We've got some top middles, top right, top middle, center, in the middle if you want to be balanced and happy. Top right, top right.
So quite a few top rights and quite a few top middles, and
halfway up top, half in the middle. Yeah, I think that's it.
Well, the answer is actually top middle. So having a high awareness of what's going on around you in the trust, in the organisation, but balancing your motives. Now, this is an interesting one, because that's the bit, lots of you said top right, being other-centred. And, that maybe comes back to what we just talked about, having the right motives, driving what you do. But actually, of course, the danger of being completely other-centred is that you don't secure what you need to do your job well. And again, that does tend to be a female trait. We know that, don't we? That women tend to be more other-centred. Not always the case. There are plenty of men as well that can be like that. And there are plenty of women, I'm sure, that can be self-centred. But we do know that quite often women will be more other-centred. And actually, what that's going to do is mean that you put everybody else first. And so you might not get what you need. And some of those things you need because you need them. As I said, your workload's too high, you're working too many hours, your pay's not right. Some of those things might be, I need this resource so I can do a better job for the trust, so we can do this well. So really thinking about balancing yourself and having high awareness. If you want to influence things, you need to know what's going on. And that's not in a gossipy way, which is different. Okay, that's knowing what's going on with professionalism, confidentiality. And of course, you are often in a key position to know what's going on, because you're seeing all the key papers and you're talking to the board and the CEO and all of that. So if you have found yourself somewhere else on this, other than middle top, have a think about what could I start to do And maybe this is where a mentor or a career buddy can help you to just shift myself a bit. If I'm completely other-centered and I'm not really focusing on what I need, how can I maybe shift a bit and start to think about how I get towards that middle ground? And similarly, if you're somebody who feels like, actually, I'm quite low on awareness of what's going on, how can you find out more? Who are the people you might need to talk to? Who are the people, what are the papers you can read or meetings you can attend or whatever that will start to help you think about that? Because if you do want to influence and persuade, you need to engage in the organisational politics, and you need to do that with good intent and also to keep yourself safe and well. And there are 3 ways to influence people, because people are influenced in very different ways depending on how their brain works and how they tend to view the world. And I love this little diagram because it really, I think, flags up what those 3 core ways are. The first type of person is that person who's really logical and rational and intellectual. And if you want to influence that person, then it's all about evidence, all about data. So if you've got, if you've got a chair who's like that, and you want some more resource or you want to do things differently, you're going to need to think about, what's my evidence? What data can I show them that's going to demonstrate this? Because that's what's going to influence them. The other type of person is emotional, and these tend to be the people that are influenced by stories, messages, values. So again, that's a very different way of influencing them. And if you've got something like that, then actually them understanding the impact from your story or other stories that you're hearing could really well influence them. And then the third person is the kind of person who likes to collaborate, likes to talk to lots of people, forms lots of alliances. So we'll check stuff out. If you're saying this is a problem, they'll have lots of alliances, they'll talk to people, they'll want to know, oh, does that person think that? Does that person think that? So you can see they're all quite different. And often when I'm working with people who are presenting papers, for example, to a board meeting, I will say, make sure you cover all 3. Because all 3 of these are going to be needed if you're writing to a group of people or you're presenting to a group of people, because in that room, you're going to have a mix. So have your data, have your evidence, throw in some stories, and think about doing a bit of networking with the people before the day so you know who's going to be on side. But if it's a conversation on a one-on-one, then it's worth just thinking about, what do I know about this person? How do they operate? And which one of these are they? So thinking about working with leaders in your own organisation, and do a bit of reflection on who are your key stakeholders, who are the most influential and why, how well do you know them, do you reach out and engage with them, what are their needs and concerns, how do they like to work, how do they like to make decisions. So if you think about those 2 models that we've looked at, it's really useful, I think, to take some time to reflect on these questions in relation to the people you actually work with, whether it's the board or executives or various different people, school governors, whoever it might be. Who are the movers and shakers that people listen to? How well do you know them? Do you talk to them? Do you reach out to them and build relationships with them? Why might they want to talk to you? What are the things that are on their mind? What can you help them with? And how do they like to work and make decisions? And that's a useful exercise to go away and do from today as well. Why is it important? Well, you can't make, some of you talked about change. You can't make change happen in isolation or in a vacuum. No matter how brilliant you are, you may be the best governance professional in the world, but unless you've got others behind you, supporting you, listening to you, nothing is going to change. So it's really important skill set. And always remember, of course, that if you're in a trust that's growing, then some of these dynamics will change. So, these people that are most influential now might be very different in the course of a couple of years. And certainly I saw that in a growing trust. The people that I had to work with in the first few years changed enormously. There was a whole different group of people that developed influence 5 years on. So always scanning the horizon and thinking about that. Okay, so we're going to move on then to challenging conversations and how to approach them. And again, just like you to pop into the chat, what kind of issues do you find difficult to bring up in your trust or school environment?
So far we have wanting a pay rise.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Pay rise issue? Yes, I think this is going to be topical. Not getting on with a colleague and pay,
Yeah.
making big changes, pay hours, changing processes, need for more staff. The CEO is also trustee, doesn't always want the trustees nosing around, asking detailed questions, needing more staff, changing processes, poor communication at times, lack of support, boss very busy, resistance to change, not enough allocated hours. Yep, a lot going on.
So lots about maybe your own pay or terms and conditions, or absolutely the stakeholders that you're working with, and how you might get them to think differently about things. And perhaps not a surprise that those are some of the things that have come up. So it starts actually with good quality feedback. And I always use this, phrase that feedback is a gift, no matter how it's packaged. Now, of course, though, how feedback is received and responded to often depends on how it's packaged. I remember this because, sometimes people have given me feedback and it's been really uncomfortable. But I've kind of thought, you know what, though, I'm going to try and accept this as a gift and think about what I can learn and develop. But not everybody's going to react like that, are they? And there are times I'm sure I haven't reacted like that either. So we need to think about how we package the feedback and how we make sure it's truly a gift for somebody. And actually they're more likely to hear it. And just thinking generally about feedback. So, we're going to talk in a minute about how do you have difficult conversations, but actually it's important that we are constantly thinking about giving feedback and doing that in a way that supports a positive culture, so giving people praise, saying thank you. And whether that's your boss, your peers, people you're working around, governors, anybody, trustees, just, thank you for sharing that so well today. I really appreciated it. Thank you for helping me with this. It was really useful. It helps reinforce those relationships when you do that. We all know how lovely it is when somebody thanks us and appreciates us, and that helps that influence. But of course, there are times when the feedback you have to give, like the examples you've given, is difficult. So firstly, it's important to think about, again, your positive intent. Why am I giving this feedback? What am I trying to achieve out of this? And making sure that you're thinking quite hard about what's the impact going to be on the person who's hearing it, because they're a human being too. A timely manner. So actually saving up feedback isn't a great idea. You might have your appraisal coming up and you want to talk to the CEO about something they did 6 months ago. No, that's not great, because they probably won't remember. And they certainly won't be open to the feedback. So thinking about how you do it, clearly, appraisal is a good opportunity to talk about feedback, but it's not great to store things up for that when it needs to be done fairly quickly in the moment. And be ready to ask for feedback, because actually, if you're willing to ask for feedback and take it constructively, you'll tend to find in that relationship, people are more likely to then be open to feedback back. And think about what feedback you do want to give your manager when you're going into an appraisal, for example. What are the things you want to talk to them about, including possibly some of the difficult things? Now, there's a great book I recommend called The Chimp Paradox. There it is. Some of you may have read it. Absolutely brilliant book, written by Professor Steve Peters. And it's all about mind management, program for confidence, success, and happiness. It's a great read because it's a really easy read. And he talks a lot in the book about how the brain operates, and where we might be in any moment in terms of our emotions and how we're feeling. And he talks about these 3 systems. He talks about the human part of our brain, which deals in facts and truth and is logical and is calm. He then talks about what he calls our chimp part of our brain, which deals in feelings and emotions. And actually, that's the bit that, if you find yourself going, what if, that's the bit that's in control. And when we're triggered with things, so if somebody's giving us some difficult feedback, it may trigger that bit of us in our brain, which then means we stop listening because we're into fight or flight. Basically, we're seeing a threat. So that's something to think about. He talks about the computer part of the brain as well, where we're pre-programmed to think in certain ways. So, if you've over the years asked for pay rises and it's always gone really badly, your brain might assume that's the way it's going to go. And therefore, you might be thinking from the chimp place. It feels emotional. It feels difficult. And the thing to be thinking about is, you don't want to be giving or receiving feedback in that place when you can feel that emotional part of your brain clouding things, where you might feel angry or frustrated or teary. And it happens to us all. I remember a conversation once with a boss many years ago who was giving me some not great feedback, and that chimp took over. But you know what I did? I said, we need a break. We need a break. Can we come back later on? Because I just need to go and get some fresh air and think. And that allowed me to get myself out of the space, get my human brain thinking about, okay, why are they saying this? How is it going to help me? What do I need to reflect on? So knowing that about yourself, but also observing what's happening with the person that you're giving the feedback to. If they're falling into that middle space and you can see they're having a very big emotional reaction, then you can actually say, look, I can see this is difficult for you. Shall we take an hour, give you a little bit of space and come back? Really, really important to spot that. And if you're giving difficult feedback, it really should be about the person's behavior, not their personality. So, here's a positive example. I really like the way you approach that problem. So it's about the behavior. You're not saying, oh, you never do this, or you always do that, or, you're just a really bad person, or you never listen to me. Anything that starts to feel like it's about somebody's character or personality is not going to be received well. So thinking quite hard about what is it about their behavior that I want to give some feedback to. And it should describe the effect of the behavior on you. When you did this, I felt this. And again, in a calm, clear way. And absolutely avoid those sweeping generalizations. And by the way, often you can practice this stuff at home, can't you? But when you say things like, you never, you always, immediately, and yourself if you're getting feedback like that, that's when your hackles go up. So really thinking through these things. And that's why, again, keeping calm and keeping that human logical side of the brain in control is very, very important when you're giving difficult feedback. It should be timely, as I've already said, and not saved up for several months down the line, but it should also be in a very quiet, confidential space where you will not be disturbed. The worst thing you can do is just, give some difficult feedback in the corridor or, in a school or whatever it might be, when it's busy. Really important to get that right, actually, because that's important for your own dignity and respect and for the individual. And as I said, take a break, be ready to do that, especially if you can anticipate that the person is going to react in a difficult way. Or if you suddenly find yourself in this place, it's okay to say, I hear what you say, but I really just need a bit of time to go away and absorb that. And then lots of you have said pay is an issue, and we want to finish with that. And this is really sensitive, and it can be very emotive for both parties. You might feel undervalued and underpaid, and that's really frustrating for you. The other party might think, well, crikey, I think you're well paid, or, others have got challenges with their pay as well. So it can be an incredibly emotive subject in my experience. So I think there's several things to do if you want to raise issues about your pay in terms of conditions. And again, to kind of get you in that human, rational, logical space about it rather than the emotion. I mean, firstly, obviously, you can chat to HR about what are your pay policies, how do they benchmark pay, have they got any processes, can they help you and support you, give you some guidance on that. As we've talked about earlier, it is important to know your own worth. The market for governance roles is really blooming. And I've talked to lots of HR directors who've said to me, we cannot get great governance professionals. So you're really marketable. The skill set's really marketable. So know that and own it. And you might want to do a little bit of assessment of the market. Be careful about that, because don't go in there with lots of clippings of job adverts and say, look, they're all paid more than me, because that actually doesn't tend to work, because we can all find job adverts that pay more than us, and we can all find job adverts that pay less than us. So it's good for you to know that, but I wouldn't use that as a strategy for the conversation. I think the most important thing you can do maybe is ask for an independent review of your pay. Suggest maybe HR do it, or is there somebody independent? And I give this advice to HR directors as well, who are obviously working on pay, senior pay and executive pay for the board, but actually bring in somebody independent, because you can't be involved in reviewing your own pay. You need somebody, if you genuinely think and you've looked at the market and you think your pay or your terms and conditions aren't right, then commission an independent expert who will support your board on that. So I think it's the same for you. So that conversation with HR is really, really important, so that you can do that in the right way. And obviously, that doesn't always go the way you want. And then we have to make decisions, don't we, personally, about, okay, can I live with this? Can I continue to try and influence it? Or actually, given, that governance professionals are really marketable, ultimately there may be other opportunities for me to think about in the future. Thank you very much. That's the content of the session, and we've got a little bit of time for any final questions, Jo.
Yeah, I'm just waiting to see if any questions come up in the chat, but that was absolutely brilliant, Mandy. Thank you so much. There was so much to take away there. And somebody did ask if we'll be sharing the slides, and we'll be sharing the slides and the recording. So hopefully you can. Oh, someone's just put, this has been amazing. No questions, but just thank you. Yeah, I fully agree. While I'm waiting, perhaps I could ask about a specific case of when you might be giving difficult feedback. How would you give difficult feedback to a senior person? Someone much more senior than you. That can be potentially challenging.
Power dynamic can be really difficult, can't it? If it's the chair of the board or something like that. I mean, firstly, I would say all the things that we've talked about in the session are very important, and even more so perhaps when it's a senior person who's got some power and influence over your career. So it's really important to think calmly, clearly, get the right space. But I think don't shy away from it, because most of the senior people I've worked with will accept feedback if it's done well. They're human beings like everybody, and sometimes we forget that. It's the chair, it's the CEO, they're Teflon coated. Well, they're not. If feedback isn't delivered well, they'll react just like anybody would, really. And perhaps even more so because they've got that power and influence. So I think really think hard about where you do it, what you say, how you do it. Go back to the influencing styles I talked about. What's going to influence them to listen? Are they going to need some evidence, or are they going to need a story and understand that impact? But absolutely doing it with respect and care. And I think, if you do that and you do it well, then it should be fine. Clearly, there are times when those things implode, sadly, and relationships break down. But that tends to be where you've got difficult characters, as opposed to, you've got somebody good you're working with that you just need to have a conversation with. And when you've got difficult characters you're working with, that is really, really hard. And that's a whole different session in itself. If you've got, I don't know, if you've got a chair that you feel is a bully, or, those kind of things going on, that's really, really tricky. And you can't necessarily control or navigate that. There are various different ways, and you have to protect yourself in that situation. But for most senior people, they're normal human beings, they're leaders, they will listen as long as it's handled in the right way.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And Louise has just put in the chat, real confidence booster. And I think I'd second that. There's a lot to take away from today that can be really helpful. If there's no more questions, we might give everyone on the call some time back. Thank you so much, Mandy. That was absolutely brilliant. Really, really useful. Thanks to everyone on the call for joining us on International Women's Day. Value yourself, everybody. Recognise what you do. Or I must say, with the feedback as a gift thing, please complete our feedback form, because we'd love to hear whether this was useful and valuable. But yeah, don't forget, go away, get a career buddy. Think about the ways to influence people. So much to take away today. But thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Mandy, and have a lovely weekend, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of International Women's Day.